August 2nd, 1944. Winston Churchill stands at the dispatch box in the House of Commons, cigar smoke still clinging to his jacket from the war room he'd just left. Before him, rows of expectant faces wait for his assessment of the war. Behind him, 13 days of bitter knowledge. Another attempt on Hitler's life had failed. Another chance to end the nightmare had slipped away. Churchill's words cut through the chamber like a blade. The highest personalities in the German Reich are murdering one another, or trying to. He tells them, his voice dripping with contempt rather than hope, while the avenging armies of the Allies close upon the doomed and ever-narrowing circle of their power. No sympathy, no acknowledgement of brave men who had tried to save their country, just cold, calculated dismissiveness. The conspirators who planted the bomb at the Wolf's Lair weren't heroes to Churchill in that moment. They were the enemy eating itself alive, and that suited him just fine. But behind the public scorn lay a more complex truth. A truth that had been building since 1941, coded in secret dossiers, whispered in war rooms, debated in the corridors of British intelligence. Winston Churchill had his own plans to kill Adolf Hitler. The question wasn't whether to assassinate the Führer. The question was whether it was worth the trouble. 3 years earlier, in 1941, Churchill had given his approval. Not a casual nod, not a reluctant acceptance, but active authorization for British intelligence to begin plotting the murder of Germany's leader. The Special Operations Executive, that shadowy organization Churchill himself had created with the directive to set Europe ablaze, turned its attention to the biggest target of all. They called it Operation Foxley. The planners worked methodically, obsessively. They studied Hitler's movements like hunters, tracking prey. They collected intelligence from prisoners of war, from defectors, from anyone who might know the Führer's habits. They learned about his personal train, the America, later renamed the Brandenburg. They mapped its routes, studied its schedule, calculated the precise spots where explosives might derail it into oblivion. But Hitler was careful. Paranoid even. Station learned of the train's arrival only minutes beforehand. The schedule changed constantly, unpredictably. The plan was deemed too uncertain. The plotters moved on. What about poison? Tasteless, lethal compounds slipped into the drinking water aboard the train. A quiet death. No drama, no heroics. But this required an inside man, someone with access, someone willing to take the risk. The complexity doomed it before it began. Then, in the summer of 1944, fortune smiled on the conspirators. A German soldier, one of Hitler's own security guards at the Berghof, was captured during the fighting in Normandy. Under interrogation, he revealed something extraordinary. Every morning, around 10 o'clock, Hitler took a 20-minute walk, alone, from the Berghof residence to the tea house on Muslaner Kopf Hill. 20 minutes, alone, out of sight of the sentry posts along the edge of a wooded area. The planners could hardly believe their luck. Here was the most heavily guarded man in Europe, and every morning he strolled unprotected through the woods like a country gentleman taking his constitutional. Even better, whenever Hitler was at the Berghof, a Nazi flag flew from the main house, visible from a cafe in the town below. A perfect signal for anyone who needed to know when the target was in residence. The plan came together quickly. A sniper, armed with a Mauser K 98K fitted with a scope. A German-speaking Pole who could pass for a Wehrmacht soldier. Parachute them into Austria, get them to the woods near the Berghof, wait for the morning walk. One shot, clean, efficient, final. They had a backup. a British sniper in case the first man failed, a Piat gun, a British anti-tank weapon in case the rifleman missed. The team would be dressed as German mountain troops. Everything was planned to the smallest detail. Intelligence poured in, photographs of the buildings, diagrams of the complex, maps of the surrounding area. The dossier grew to 122 pages, every angle covered, every contingency planned. They knew the weather patterns, the guard rotations, the sight lines. They knew which trees would provide cover, which paths Hitler preferred. The most likely date for the attempt was identified, July 13th or 14th, 1944, during one of Hitler's visits to the Berghof. But July 13th came and went. So did the 14th. No sniper materialized in the woods. No rifle shot echoed across the mountain. Operation Foxley remained on the paper, a beautifully detailed fantasy that would never become reality. 6 days after the planned date, on July 20th, someone else tried. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, aristocrat and true believer, walked into a conference room at the Wolf's Lair with a briefcase. Inside, a bomb. He placed it under the table near Hitler's feet and excused himself. At 12:42 in the afternoon, the bomb detonated. 4 men died. Hitler was not one of them. The explosion demolished the conference room. Bodies flew through the air. The stenographer died instantly. But Hitler, shielded by the heavy oak table leg that someone had inadvertently moved the briefcase behind, survived with singed trousers, a perforated eardrum, and conjunctivitis. His personal physician administered penicillin taken from captured Allied soldiers. Within hours, Hitler was receiving visitors, showing them his torn uniform like a trophy. News reached London quickly. The conspiracy had been massive, involving dozens of high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, civil servants, aristocrats. It was the closest anyone had come to killing Hitler since Georg Elser's bomb at the Bürger Bräukeller in 1939, which had missed the Führer by 5 minutes. Churchill received the reports in his war rooms. Maps covered the walls, showing Allied advances in Normandy, the Soviet push from the east. Victory was no longer a question. Only timing remained uncertain. The war might end in months, or it might drag on for years, consuming millions more lives. Hitler's survival changed nothing strategically, but it revealed everything about the fractures within Germany. The Nazi high command was eating itself. Paranoia would spread. Trust would evaporate. Already the Gestapo was rounding up suspects by the hundreds. In private, Churchill's reaction was more nuanced than his public dismissal suggested. He understood what the July plot represented. These were not fanatics or glory seekers. They were Germany's military elite, men who had watched Hitler's decisions doom their nation, men who had finally accepted that only Hitler's death could stop the catastrophe. But they had failed. And their failure, Churchill recognized, might actually serve Allied interests. The purge that followed was merciless. Stauffenberg was shot that same night, along with other key conspirators. General Ludwig Beck, who would have become provisional head of state if the coup succeeded, was forced to commit suicide. Over the next months, more than 7,000 people were arrested. Between 4,000 and 5,000 were executed after brutal interrogations and show trials. Judge Roland Freisler presided over the People's Court like a theatrical production. He screamed at defendants, mocked them while cameras recorded their humiliation. Some conspirators chose suicide rather than face his courtroom. Others, like Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, who would have been chancellor in the new government, were hanged after months of imprisonment. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the Lutheran pastor and theologian who had been involved in earlier plots, was executed in April 1945, just weeks before the war's end. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, who had allowed conspirators to use his intelligence network, was hanged at Flossenbürg concentration camp. The purge continued almost until the final collapse of the Third Reich. Churchill watched this chaos unfold with the cold calculation of a man who had spent 5 years trying to destroy Nazi Germany. The internal bleeding served his purposes. Every officer executed was one less competent commander the Wehrmacht could field. Every bout of paranoia made Hitler more isolated, more erratic in his decision-making. And that was precisely why Operation Foxley had never been executed. The debate within British intelligence had been fierce. On one side stood men like Churchill, initially eager to eliminate the threat. On the other stood analysts like Lieutenant Colonel Ronald Thornley, deputy head of SOE's German Directorate, who made a compelling counter-argument. "Kill Hitler," Thornley argued, "and you create a martyr." The German people could blame their defeat on his death, rather than on their flawed ideology. They might believe Germany would have won if only the Führer had lived. It would be Versailles all over again, the stab in the back myth reborn, the seeds of another war planted before this one even ended. More importantly, Thornley and others pointed out something Churchill's military advisors had been saying for years. Hitler was a terrible strategist. His insistence on absolute control, his refusal to listen to his generals, his increasingly paranoid and erratic decision-making, all of it was helping the Allied cause. He demanded that armies fight to the last man in indefensible positions. He split his forces, ignored logistics, and based strategy on intuition rather than reality. Replace Hitler with someone competent, someone who would listen to professional military advice, and the war might drag on for years. The cost in Allied lives could be staggering. Churchill's position evolved as these arguments sank in. The man who had authorized the hatching of plots to assassinate Nazi leaders in 1941 now found himself questioning whether killing Hitler was strategically sound. By the summer of 1944, as Operation Foxley was being finalized, the momentum had shifted against execution. There were other concerns. Making Hitler a martyr might interfere with the complete destruction of Nazi ideology that the Allies demanded. The goal was not just military victory, but the total eradication of the Nazi system. That required Germany to be utterly defeated, with no excuses, no myths, no legends. Hitler needed to fall with his regime, not before it. And there was a practical problem. By July 1944, Hitler had already left the Berghof for the last time. He would never return. The beautiful, detailed plans for the sniper in the woods were based on intelligence that had become obsolete. Hitler spent his final year moving between headquarters near the front lines and his bunker in Berlin. The opportunity, if it had ever truly existed, was gone. So Operation Foxley remained a contingency, a backup plan that would never be needed. In November 1944, the proposal was formally submitted, but by then it was too late. The war was clearly in its final phase. On March 26, 1945, with victory weeks away, the SOE scrapped the plan entirely. But Churchill's public reaction to the July plot revealed his state of mind in August 1944. Standing in the House of Commons, he offered no words of encouragement for the German resistance, no acknowledgement that brave men had tried to stop the madness. Only contempt. Only the observation that Germany's leaders were killing each other while Allied armies closed in. It was a calculated message. To his own people, It signaled that the enemy was crumbling from within. To the Germans, it offered no hope of negotiated peace, no recognition of good faith efforts to remove Hitler. The Allied policy remained unchanged: unconditional surrender. Nothing less would be accepted. The message was reinforced in other ways. When Churchill learned of the German internal resistance, he never moderated his rhetoric. He never suggested that there were good Germans who deserved consideration. The entire Nazi leadership, the entire German military establishment, all of it was condemned together. This was not merely rhetoric. Churchill understood that any hint of willingness to negotiate with Hitler's replacements would undermine Allied unity. Stalin, in particular, was deeply suspicious of any separate peace between the Western Allies and Germany. The Soviets had borne the brunt of German aggression, had lost millions of soldiers and civilians. They would never accept anything less than Germany's complete destruction. Churchill's dismissive reaction to the July plot also served domestic political purposes. By August 1944, the British people had endured 5 years of total war. They had survived the Blitz, sent their sons to die in Africa and Italy and France. They had rationed food, lived in darkness, worked in factories around the clock. They wanted victory, not nuance. They wanted their enemies punished, not praised for belated conscience. So Churchill gave them what they wanted. The image of German leaders murdering each other while Allied armies advanced was satisfying. It suggested that the Nazi regime was not just losing militarily, but disintegrating morally. The evil was consuming itself. In private, however, Churchill and his advisors continued to debate what the July plot meant. British intelligence analyzed the conspiracy in detail, trying to understand how deep the resistance went, whether it might produce another attempt, whether Hitler's survival would make him more or less effective as a military leader. The analysis suggested that Hitler would become even more paranoid, more isolated, more dependent on a shrinking circle of fanatics. This proved accurate. In the months after the July plot, Hitler increasingly withdrew from public view. He stopped making speeches, rarely met with anyone outside his immediate staff. The man who had once commanded massive rallies now hid in bunkers, issuing orders to armies that existed only on paper. The Purge also eliminated many of the Wehrmacht's most capable officers. Men who might have organized effective defenses, who might have salvaged something from Germany's collapsing position, were executed or forced into retirement. The officer corps was decimated not by Allied action, but by Nazi paranoia. Churchill watched this unfold with grim satisfaction. Every execution weakened Germany's military effectiveness. Every bout of paranoia made Hitler's decision-making worse. The strategy of leaving Hitler alive, of letting him destroy his own military through incompetence and paranoia, was paying dividends. But there was another layer to Churchill's thinking, one that historians would debate for decades. Did he really believe Hitler was more useful alive than dead? Or was Operation Foxley always a contingency, plan, something to attempt only if the war dragged on beyond all expectations? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Churchill authorized the planning because he wanted options. If the war bogged down, if casualties mounted beyond acceptable levels, if it looked like Germany might stabilize its position, then killing Hitler would be back on the table. But as long as the war progressed favorably, as long as Allied armies advanced and German resistance crumbled, there was no need to take the risk. The risk was real. An assassination attempt that failed might galvanize German resistance. It might give Hitler propaganda value, proof that the Allies would stoop to any tactic, that they feared him enough to send assassins. It might even strengthen his grip on power as he purged anyone suspected of disloyalty. And if the attempt succeeded but the assassin was captured, if it became clear that Britain had ordered Hitler's murder, the diplomatic complications could be severe. The Soviet Union might see it as evidence of a separate peace attempt. Neutral nations might condemn it as barbaric. The moral high ground, such as it was, might be compromised. These considerations weighed heavily. Churchill was not squeamish about unconventional warfare. He had created the SOE specifically to engage in sabotage, assassination, and subversion. But Hitler was not just another target. His death would have consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate military situation. So the dossier gathered dust. The sniper remained in Britain. The plans for poison and bombs and Piat guns stayed theoretical. And Hitler, protected by his own paranoia and the twisted logic of strategic calculation, survived. He survived Georg Elser's bomb in 1939. He survived multiple attempts in 1943 and early 1944. He survived Stauffenberg's briefcase bomb on July 20th. He survived Operation Foxley by the simple expedient of changing his routine and never returning to the place where he was vulnerable. In April 1945, as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin and Allied armies closed in from all sides, Churchill authorized one last attempt. He ordered Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris to target the Berghof complex with heavy bombers. If they could catch Hitler there, the war might end days or weeks sooner. The RAF sent squadron leader James Templeman Rook with precise orders: destroy Hermann Göring's house at the Obersalzberg. Intelligence suggested Hitler might be nearby. The bombers made their run, dropped their payloads, and turned for home. But Hitler was not there. He was in his Berlin bunker, surrounded by the ruins of his 1,000-year Reich. The bombing achieved nothing except the destruction of empty buildings. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler took his own life. The man who had survived dozens of assassination attempts, who had been protected by fate and fortune and the strategic calculations of his enemies, chose death over capture. He shot himself in his bunker, surrounded by maps showing armies that no longer existed, issuing orders to divisions that had ceased to exist. Churchill learned of Hitler's death while at his map room, surrounded by the apparatus of war. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement. Just a notation on the timeline of history's bloodiest conflict. The monster was dead. The war in Europe was effectively over. Looking back, the question remains: should Churchill have tried harder to kill Hitler? Should Operation Foxley have been executed despite the risks? Would the war have ended sooner, saving countless lives? The answers are unknowable. But what we do know is this: Churchill made a cold, calculated decision that Hitler alive was more useful than Hitler dead. He made that decision based on the best intelligence available, the advice of his military experts, and his understanding of Nazi psychology. The July plot conspirators, brave men who sacrificed everything to try to stop Hitler, received only contempt from Churchill. Not because he failed to understand their courage, but because acknowledging it would undermine Allied strategy. There could be no good Germans in the narrative, no honorable enemies worthy of negotiation. Only the complete destruction of the Nazi regime would suffice. History has been kinder to the July plot conspirators than Churchill was. We remember them as heroes who tried to save their country when it was almost too late. We name streets after Stauffenberg, Honor Beck and Tresckow, and the others who died trying to stop the nightmare. But in August 1944, standing in the House of Commons with victory visible but not yet secured, Churchill offered them no such recognition. He saw only German leaders murdering each other while Allied armies closed in, and he was satisfied with that picture. The sniper who never materialized in the woods near Berghof's garden, the poison that was never slipped into Hitler's water, the bomb that was never planted on his train, all of it remained theoretical. Operation Foxley, one of the most detailed assassination plans ever developed, never moved beyond the planning stage, and Winston Churchill, the man who authorized it, watched Hitler survive attempt after attempt and made peace with letting fate take its course. The monster would fall with his regime, not before it. That was the calculated, cold-blooded decision of a man fighting history's most terrible war. When the highest personalities in the German Reich tried to murder one another, Churchill watched with contempt, not hope, because he understood something fundamental. Sometimes your enemies serve you better by staying alive. That was what Churchill said and what he believed when he heard Hitler survived another assassination attempt. Not celebration of resistance, not encouragement of German conscience, but cold observation that the Nazi regime was devouring itself while Allied armies advanced. And in the end, he was proven right. The Third Reich collapsed completely, with no myth of betrayal, no legend of Hitler martyred before his time. Just utter defeat, absolute destruction, and the complete discrediting of Nazi ideology. It was not the ending the July plot conspirators had hoped for, but it was the ending Churchill demanded. And when the dust settled, when the bodies were counted and the ruins surveyed, when the full horror of the Nazi regime was revealed to the world, there was no one left to make excuses. That, perhaps, was Churchill's greatest victory. Not killing Hitler, but ensuring that when he finally died, he took everything down with him,